Did a queen ever go hungry in her own castle? Could she trust the food on her plate, or was every meal a risk? What did it taste like to be powerful when the world outside the stone walls was starving? The food on a medieval queen's table was more than just sustenance. It was power, it was medicine, it was a message, and some of it was very strange. Number 20, what made yellow powder more valuable than gold? A single thread of it cost more than a commoner earned in a day. An ounce of it could buy a horse. A pound of it could ransom a nobleman. It wasn't gold, it was saffron, the dried stigmas of the crocus sativus flower. To us, it's a pricey spice for paella or risotto. To a medieval queen, it was liquid sunshine, a tangible display of immense wealth. The cost was staggering because the labor was immense. Each crocus flower produces only 3 tiny crimson threads. These threads must be harvested by hand at dawn before the sun wilts them. It took around 75,000 flowers to produce a single pound of saffron. That's a football field-sized patch of land meticulously farmed and harvested by hand for a small bag of spice. Entire economies, like that of the English town Saffron Walden, were built on this delicate crop. When a queen saw a dish arrive at the high table, glowing with a vibrant yellow-orange hue, she wasn't just seeing color. She was seeing money, she was seeing the cost of a warship or a small castle right there on her plate. Saffron was used in everything from sauces for roasted swan to custards and cakes. It gave food a golden color, imitating the precious metal itself. It was a way to eat your wealth, to show foreign ambassadors and rival lords that your kingdom was so prosperous you could afford to consume treasure. But it wasn't just for show. Saffron was a critical part of the medieval pharmacy. The medical system of the time was based on the 4 humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was an imbalance of these humors. Foods and spices were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and used to correct these imbalances. Saffron was considered hot and dry. A queen suffering from melancholy, which was believed to be caused by an excess of cold and wet black bile, might be prescribed saffron in her food or wine. It was thought to cheer the spirit and lighten the mood. For a queen under the immense pressure of producing an heir and navigating court politics, a dose of something to ward off depression was a serious medical treatment. It was also used in childbirth. A queen's primary duty was to provide a male heir. Her life and the stability of the kingdom depended on it. Saffron was believed to ease labor pains and bring forth the child. It was a high-stakes prescription. The queen's ladies in waiting and physicians would have administered saffron-laced broths and drinks, praying it would work. The value of saffron made it a target. Adulteration was rampant. Merchants would mix the expensive threads with cheaper materials like safflower, turmeric, or even shredded dyed meat. The punishment for selling fake saffron was severe. In 14th century Nuremberg, saffron forgers were burned at the stake or buried alive. For a queen's court, ensuring the purity of the saffron was a matter of national importance. Her cooks would have been experts at identifying the real thing, checking its color, scent, and the way it bled its color into water. A fake batch of saffron wasn't just a culinary insult. It was a threat. It could mean a medical treatment was ineffective, or worse, that a dish was poisoned. The queen's food taster earned his keep on dishes like these. So when a queen like Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III of England, ate a saffron-infused custard, she was tasting a complex blend of economics, medicine, and power. The spice on her tongue represented global trade routes, backbreaking agricultural labor, and the cutting-edge medical theories of her day. It was a statement that she was rich enough to eat gold and healthy enough to rule. Number 19, could you build a castle out of dessert? A queen's coronation feast wasn't just a meal, it was a piece of theater, and the stars of the show were often made of sugar. Not as a sweetener in the modern sense, but as an architectural material. At the end of a grand feast, servants would carry in elaborate sculptures molded entirely from sugar paste. These were called subtleties. They could be castles with tiny flags, knights on horseback, mythical beasts, or even scenes from religious stories. Sugar was not a common kitchen staple. It was an incredibly expensive import from the East, brought back to Europe by crusaders. It was sold by the ounce, like a rare spice, and kept under lock and key. It was often purchased from an apothecary, a pharmacist, because its primary use was considered medicinal. Like saffron, it was classified by humoral theory, believed to be hot and moist. A queen with a cold or a cough would be prescribed a spoonful of sugar. It was a medicine for the rich. The ability to waste this precious spice on a purely decorative sculpture was the ultimate power move. It told everyone present that the queen's treasury was so vast she could afford to create temporary art from a substance worth its weight in silver. These subtleties were often political. At the wedding feast of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, a subtlety might depict the two lions of England and the fleur-de-lis of France united, a sweet edible piece of propaganda. The creation of these sugar castles was a highly skilled art. The royal cook, often a man of high status himself, would oversee a team of confectioners. They would boil the sugar into a paste, sometimes mixed with ground almonds, marzipan, or gum tragacanth for strength. They would then press this paste into intricate wooden or wax molds. Once hardened, the pieces were assembled and painted with edible colors, like saffron for yellow or sandalwood for red, and sometimes even decorated with gold leaf. Imagine being a queen, like Isabella of France, at a feast. After courses of roasted peacock and jellied fish, a perfect gleaming white castle is placed on the high table. It's a miniature version of a real fortress, complete with crenellations and towers. It's not just a dessert, it's a message. It says, "Our power is as strong and pure as this fortress. Our wealth is so great we can afford to have you eat it." The taste would be nothing like modern candy. Early refined sugar was not as pure as ours. It was often brownish and had a more complex, slightly molasses-like flavor. And the texture of these sculptures was hard, meant more for admiration than easy consumption. Guests might break off a piece as a souvenir, a token of the magnificent event. For the queen herself, sugar was a personal luxury. Her private chambers would have a spice chest, and in it, alongside cloves and nutmeg, would be a cone or loaf of hard sugar. She might have a small piece dissolved in her wine. This wasn't for sweetness, but for health and status. It was a quiet reminder of her position, even in her private moments. The state of her teeth, however, was a different story. The sugar-rich diets of the aristocracy led to widespread dental decay, a problem unknown to the peasantry whose diets were almost entirely sugar-free. A queen's sweet smile could hide a mouthful of pain. Number 18, what part of a whale belonged to the queen? When a whale washed ashore on the coast of medieval England, it wasn't a natural wonder. It was royal property. A law from the 14th century, during the reign of Edward II, declared these animals royal fish. This meant they belonged to the crown. Specifically, the law was very clear. The head belonged to the king, and the tail belonged to the queen. This might sound like a strange and arbitrary division, but there was a practical reason behind it. The king claimed the head because the whale's tongue was considered a great delicacy. It was a huge piece of meat reserved for the king's table, but the queen's claim on the tail was arguably more valuable. The tail section contained the whale's baleen, the flexible, bristle-like plates whales used to filter food. In an age before plastic, baleen was a revolutionary material. It was strong yet flexible. The queen could use it to make ribs for her corsets, giving her the fashionable, rigid silhouette of the time. It was used for whip handles, collars, and various other items. So the queen's right to the whale's tail was a right to a valuable industrial commodity. But whales were also eaten. Today, the idea is shocking to many. In the Middle Ages, it was a practical solution to a religious problem. The church's calendar was filled with fast days, including all of Lent, every Friday, and numerous vigils. On these days, eating meat from land animals was forbidden, but fish was allowed, and medieval scholars, with their unique understanding of biology, classified whales, porpoises, and dolphins as fish. They lived in the water, so they were fish. Simple as that. This meant that a pious queen could enjoy a hearty, fatty, red meat-like meal on a fast day without sinning. Whale meat, called craspois or graspois, was usually salted and preserved in barrels, then shipped inland to royal castles. It was not a food for the poor. It was a luxury item, a special treat for Lent. The logistics of getting a piece of whale from the coast to a palace in London or Windsor were enormous, adding to its cost and prestige. How was it cooked? Royal chefs would treat it much like beef. It might be roasted on a spit or boiled and served with a sharp sauce made of vinegar and spices to cut through the rich, oily flavor. Recipes from the time call for whale to be served in a peppery sauce or stewed with peas. The taste was likely very strong and fishy, something our modern palates would find overpowering. But for a medieval palate accustomed to heavily spiced and preserved foods, it was a welcome change from salted cod or herring during the long weeks of Lent. For a queen, the arrival of a barrel of whale meat at the castle was significant. It meant her court could maintain its high-status diet even while observing religious rules. It was a display of her piety and her wealth. A queen like Eleanor of Castile, known for her devotion, would have ensured her household strictly followed the fasting laws. Having whale on the menu allowed her to do so without sacrificing the grandeur expected of a royal court. It solved a practical problem: how to feed a large, high-status household a satisfying meal when most protein sources were off limits. The surprising answer for a medieval queen was a slice of whale. Number 17, why was this rodent considered a fish? The beaver is a furry, dam-building rodent. It lives on land and in fresh water. It is, by any modern scientific definition, a mammal. But to the medieval church, and therefore to the medieval queen, the beaver was a fish. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate and very convenient reclassification. The reasoning was twofold. First, the beaver spent a lot of time in the water. Second, its broad, flat, scaly tail looked very much like a fish's tail. Based on this observation, clerical scholars declared the beaver to be an aquatic animal. This meant that, like the whale and the porpoise, its meat could be eaten on fast days. It was Lenten approved. This ruling was a culinary gift to the aristocracy. Beaver meat, especially the tail, was highly prized. The tail was fatty and rich, and when roasted, the skin was said to become crisp like pork crackling. The rest of the animal's meat was dark and gamey, often compared to venison. It provided a delicious, meaty meal during times when beef, pork, and chicken were forbidden. For a queen managing a large and important household, this was incredibly useful. Lent was 40 days long, and Fridays were a year-round affair. Finding variety for the high table was a constant challenge. The usual Lenten fare consisted of various fish like herring, cod, and eel, along with bread, vegetables, and almond milk. Beaver offered a welcome and luxurious break from the monotony. A queen could host a magnificent feast on a Friday, serving roasted beaver as the centerpiece, and still be seen as perfectly pious. Beavers were hunted and trapped across Europe, and their pelts were, of course, extremely valuable for making hats and trimming robes. But the meat was a significant byproduct for the wealthy. Royal estates often included rivers and streams that were managed for their beaver populations. A gift of a beaver to the queen was a sign of great respect. The cooking process was similar to that for other game meats. The animal would be skinned with the valuable pelt set aside. The carcass would then be roasted on a spit over an open fire. The tail was often cooked separately, sometimes boiled first and then roasted to achieve that desired crispy skin. Royal cooks would have served it with a strong sauce, perhaps a galantine made from breadcrumbs, vinegar, and spices like ginger and pepper to complement the gamey flavor. This classification highlights the medieval worldview. It was a world where observation and theology trumped biology. If a part of an animal looked like a fish and it lived in the water, it could be a fish for dietary purposes. The same logic was sometimes applied to barnacle geese. Because these geese were often seen on driftwood, it was believed they spontaneously generated from barnacles. As they didn't hatch from an egg laid on land, some argued they weren't flesh and could be eaten during Lent. So, when Queen Isabella, the She-Wolf of France, sat down to a Lenten meal, her plate might hold a roasted beaver tail. For her, it was not a strange contradiction. It was a perfect harmony of faith and luxury. It was a way to obey God's law as interpreted by the church while still eating like a queen. It was a delicious, clever loophole. Number 16, what did it mean to eat a rainbow? Medieval feasts were not just about taste. They were about sight. Color was everything. A dish that was bland in color was a dish that was bland in status. Royal cooks were artists, and their medium was food. One of their most popular creations was a multicolored jelly, a shimmering, edible mosaic that would have astonished guests. These jellies were not the sweet fruit-flavored desserts we know. They were savory. The base was a strong, clear broth made from boiling down animal bones, usually from calves' feet, fish, or pigs' trotters. This process extracted collagen, which would cause the broth to set into a firm jelly as it cooled. This aspic, or jelly, as it was called, was the canvas. The artistry came from the coloring. Cooks used a palette of natural ingredients. For yellow, they used saffron. For red, they used sandalwood or alkanet root. For green, they used parsley or spinach juice. For black, they used boiled blood or dark spices. A particularly clever trick was to make a white jelly using almond milk or boiled rice flour, and a purple one using turnsole, a plant-based dye. The most impressive jellies were layered. A cook would pour a thin layer of, say, red jelly into a mold. Once it had set, they would pour a layer of yellow jelly on top and wait for that to set. They would repeat this process, creating a striped rainbow effect. Sometimes they would suspend whole pieces of food within the layers, small cooked fish, pieces of chicken, or crayfish. The final product, when turned out of its mold, was a transparent block showcasing a colorful, perfectly arranged scene. It was like a medieval snow globe, but made of meat broth. For a queen, this dish was a spectacle. It showed off the skill of her kitchen staff and the wealth of her court. Making a perfect, clear jelly required time, expensive ingredients, and a lot of fuel for the long boiling process. The coloring agents, especially saffron, were costly. The whole production was a display of resources. Jellies were also often molded into fantastic shapes. They had molds for fish, for castles, for lions, and for religious symbols. A feast for a queen might feature a jelly in the shape of her family's crest, colored in the appropriate heraldic shades. It was edible branding. There was a medical reason for the popularity of jellies too. The broth was believed to be highly nutritious and easy to digest. It was considered a restorative food, perfect for someone who was ill or recovering from childbirth. A queen who was feeling weak might be served a simple, clear chicken jelly by her physicians. It was medieval comfort food, the equivalent of our chicken soup. The texture would have been much firmer and more rubbery than modern Jell-O, and the taste would have been savory and meaty, infused with the spices and wine used in the broth. It might be flavored with ginger, cloves, and pepper. It was served cool, a refreshing contrast to the many roasted meats on the table. When a queen like Margaret of Anjou looked at a multicolored heraldic jelly at her wedding feast, she was seeing more than just food. She was seeing a declaration of allegiance, a work of art, and a testament to the power and sophistication of her new court. It was a dish that fed the eyes as much as the stomach. Number 15, why would a queen eat a parasite? It was a creature from the depths of a nightmare. A long, eel-like fish with a round, jawless, sucker mouth filled with rings of sharp, horny teeth. It survived by latching onto other fish and sucking their blood. This was the lamprey, and it was one of the most sought-after delicacies on a medieval queen's table. The love for lampreys among the English royalty was legendary and at times fatal. King Henry famously died in 1135 after eating a surfeit of lampreys against his doctor's orders. This story served as a cautionary tale, but it did little to dampen the aristocracy's appetite for this strange creature. The city of Gloucester was required by royal charter to send a pie filled with lampreys to the monarch every Christmas. This tradition lasted for centuries, so why was this unappealing parasite so popular? The answer lies in its taste and texture. Lampreys have no bones, only a flexible rod of cartilage for a spine. Their flesh is very rich, fatty, and meaty, with a flavor that was considered far superior to that of other fish. This made them a prime choice for Lenten meals and other fast days. For a court tired of salted herring, a fresh lamprey was a luxurious treat. Preparing a lamprey was a complex and often gruesome process. The first step was to bleed the creature. They were often hung up by the head or sliced to let their blood drain into a bowl. This blood was not discarded. It was a key ingredient in the sauce, used to thicken and enrich it. The lamprey's notorious slime also had to be removed, usually by scalding it with hot water. The most famous way to cook lamprey was to bake it in a rich spiced pie. The fish would be stewed in a sauce of its own blood, wine, vinegar, and expensive spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. Onions and raisins were often added for sweetness. This thick, dark, and intensely flavored mixture was then encased in a heavy pastry crust, known as a coffin, and baked. For a queen, to be served a lamprey pie was a sign of great honor. It was an expensive dish. Lampreys were seasonal and difficult to catch, making them a rare commodity. A queen like Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful and sophisticated ruler, would have appreciated the complex flavors of a well-made lamprey dish. Her court would have included cooks who were masters of this particular recipe. The medical beliefs surrounding lampreys were mixed. Because of their richness, they were considered to be a hot and moist food in the humoral system. This meant they could be dangerous if eaten in excess, as they could cause an imbalance of the humors. And Henry I's death was seen as proof of this. A queen's physician would have likely advised her to eat lamprey in moderation. He would have been especially cautious if she were pregnant or ill. The demand for lampreys had a real economic impact. Rivers like the Severn were famous for their lamprey populations, and the fishermen there had a lucrative trade with the royal court. The journey from Gloucester to London was long, and the lampreys had to be transported live in special containers to ensure they were fresh for the king's or queen's table. This logistical effort further added to their mystique and cost. A lamprey pie wasn't just dinner, it was a demonstration of a supply chain that stretched across the kingdom, all to bring a specific delicacy to the royal palate. Number 14 was this white blob, the ultimate comfort food. Imagine a pale, creamy, soupy pudding. It's savory, not sweet. It's made from chicken, but you can't see any chicken. This was blancmange or blanc manger, which translates to white food. It was one of the most common and versatile dishes in medieval Europe, appearing on the tables of queens and the sickbeds of commoners. But it was nothing like the wobbly, cornstarch-based dessert of the same name today. Medieval blancmange was a staple of aristocratic cuisine. Its two core ingredients were shredded white meat, usually chicken or capon, and a liquid base of almond milk. The meat would be boiled until it was incredibly tender, then shredded and pounded into a fine paste with a mortar and pestle. This paste was then mixed with almond milk, rice flour to thicken it, and often a little sugar and ginger for flavor. The whole mixture was gently cooked until it became a thick, smooth, white puree. The color was critical. White was associated with purity and elegance. A table filled with white dishes was considered sophisticated. Blancmange was often the centerpiece of a white-themed course at a grand feast. It might be served alongside white jellies, roasted white birds, and white custards. For a queen, this color coding of meals was part of the pageantry of dining, but blancmange had another, more important role. It was considered the perfect food for the sick and infirm. According to humoral theory, chicken and almonds were both nourishing and balanced. The dish was easy to digest, making it ideal for someone with a delicate stomach. A queen recovering from a difficult childbirth like Elizabeth of York would have been fed a diet heavy on blancmange. It was thought to restore her strength and help her produce healthy milk for the royal heir. When a royal was ill, their physicians would prescribe blancmange as a key part of their recovery. It was medieval medicine on a spoon. Its versatility was another reason for its popularity. While the classic version was chicken and almond, cooks made many variations. On fish days, the chicken was replaced with fish like pike or cod. The almond milk base could be substituted with cow's milk if it wasn't a fast day. The dish could be made richer with cream or egg yolks for a special occasion. It could also be colored. Saffron would turn it a beautiful yellow, or parsley juice a vibrant green. A creative cook could serve a trio of blancmanges in different colors. The texture would have been a smooth, thick porridge. The flavor was delicate savory from the chicken, slightly nutty from the almonds, with a hint of warmth from the ginger, and a subtle sweetness from the sugar. Sugar, remember, was used as a spice, not just a sweetener, so its presence in a savory chicken dish was not unusual. It was often garnished with fried almonds and a sprinkle of sugar. For a queen, blancmange was a constant presence. It was a status symbol at her feasts, a medical prescription when she was ill, and a reliable, elegant staple for her private meals. It represented the ideal medieval food, visually appealing, aligned with medical theory, and adaptable to the strict rules of the religious calendar. It was simple, but its significance was profound. Number 13, could a bird be cooked and served alive? The most spectacular dish at a medieval royal feast was not about taste. It was pure theater. It was a pie, but not just any pie. It was a pie from which live birds would fly out when it was cut open. This was a 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie moment brought to life. The creator of this spectacle was a master of illusion. The process was a closely guarded secret of the top royal cooks. It involved two main components, a pre-baked pie shell and live birds. The pie itself was a large, hollow pastry case, often called a coffin. It was baked empty with a lid that could be removed. It was, in effect, an edible cage. Just before serving, the cook would carefully lift the lid, place live birds inside thrushes, blackbirds, or even smaller birds like sparrows, and then replace the lid, sealing it with a bit of pastry dough. The pie would be decorated extravagantly on the outside, perhaps gilded with a mixture of egg yolk and saffron to make it shine. When this magnificent pie was brought into the great hall and placed before the queen, it looked like any other large savory pie. The true purpose was revealed at the moment of serving. A designated person, perhaps the queen herself or a high-ranking lord, would cut into the crust. At that moment, the startled birds would burst out of the pie and fly up into the rafters of the hall, creating a moment of shock, laughter, and wonder among the guests. This was not a dish for eating. The birds were not cooked. The pie crust itself might be eaten, but the main purpose was entertainment. It was a subtlety, a clever trick, meant to delight and impress. For a queen hosting a diplomatic envoy, a spectacle like this was a powerful statement. It demonstrated a level of wealth and sophistication that went far beyond mere food. It showed that her court was a place of magic and marvels. A similar, and perhaps even more dramatic, dish was the roasted peacock or swan, redressed in its feathers. This was another masterpiece of the medieval kitchen. The bird would be carefully skinned, ensuring the entire skin with the head and all the feathers remained in one piece. The body of the bird would then be roasted. Once cooked, the meat was placed back inside its own feathered skin, which was sewn up around it. The bird was then arranged on a platter in a lifelike pose, often with its neck and tail feathers supported by wires. Its beak and crest might be gilded with gold leaf. When this creation was carried into the hall, it looked like a live, beautiful bird sitting on a platter. It was a stunning illusion. The flesh of these birds, however, was notoriously tough and stringy. Peacock meat, in particular, was not known for its good taste. But that didn't matter. The point was the visual impact. Guests would admire the spectacle, and then servants would carve the meat, which was often heavily seasoned with spices to make it more palatable. For a queen like Anne of Bohemia, first wife of Richard II, these dishes were central to the courtly life of chivalry and romance. Feasts were elaborate productions, and the food was part of the performance. A redressed swan on the table was like a prop in a play, a symbol of beauty and nobility. Knights would sometimes make their vows on a swan, a practice known as the vow of the swan. These theatrical foods reveal a key aspect of the medieval royal mindset. Food was not just fuel, it was communication, it was a way to display power, entertain guests, and create a sense of awe and wonder. For a queen whose position depended on projecting an image of magnificence, a pie full of live birds was worth more than a dozen perfectly cooked, but visually boring chickens. Number 12, why did they eat? So many tiny birds. In the grand medieval hall, alongside the giant roasts of beef and the theatrical peacocks, were platters piled high with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of tiny birds. Larks, thrushes, sparrows, finches, and buntings. These small songbirds, what we would now consider wild birds to be admired, were a common and highly prized food for the aristocracy. Eating these birds was a mark of delicacy and refinement. While a peasant might eat a hearty chunk of beef or pork, a queen or a noble lady was thought to have a more delicate appetite. Eating a tiny bite-sized bird was seen as more befitting of her status. It was a dainty food for a dainty person. There was also an element of conspicuous consumption involved. It took a great many larks to make a satisfying meal. A single serving might be a dozen of them, spitted on a skewer and roasted whole. The effort required to catch, pluck, and cook so many tiny creatures for a single dish was immense. This made them a luxury. It showed that the queen's household had the manpower and resources to prepare such a labor-intensive food. These birds were caught in nets by fowlers. They were a common sight in the countryside, but bringing them to the royal table in large quantities was a different matter. They were usually cooked very simply. After being plucked and cleaned, they were skewered, sometimes with a small piece of bacon or a sage leaf for flavor, and roasted over an open fire until crisp. They were eaten whole, bones and all. The tiny, delicate bones would become brittle from the roasting, and diners would crunch through them. One popular dish was lark pie. A pie crust would be filled with dozens of these small birds, often baked with a savory, spiced gravy. Another method was to encase them in individual pastry coffins. For a queen, these birds might be served as part of a multi-course feast, a light and delicate offering between heavier meat courses. A queen's private meal, when she dined away from the full court, might also feature a plate of roasted larks. It was a food that was both simple and luxurious at the same time. The consumption of these birds also reflects the medieval relationship with nature. The natural world was a resource to be used. The distinction we make today between wild animals to be conserved and farm animals to be eaten was not so clear-cut. If it could be caught, it could be eaten. The forests and fields were the larder of the aristocracy. A queen like Joan of Navarre, second wife of Henry IV, would have seen nothing unusual about this. Her household accounts would have shown regular purchases of larks and small birds by the dozen. It was a normal part of her diet, a food that reinforced her elite status. It was a subtle way of demonstrating that even the smallest creatures of the sky were there to serve her table. The sound of a lark singing in a field meant one thing to a peasant and something entirely different to a queen. For the queen, it was the sound of her next meal. Number 11. How did almonds replace the cow? In the modern world, almond milk is a trendy alternative to dairy. In the medieval world of a queen, it was the default. For much of the year, cow's milk was simply not an option for the royal kitchen. The reason was twofold: religion and practicality. First, the religious rules. The church forbade the consumption of all animal products, including milk, cheese, and butter on fast days. This included the 40 days of Lent, every Friday, and numerous other holy days, making up a significant portion of the year. For a pious queen and her court, this rule was non-negotiable. Second, the practical problem. Before refrigeration, fresh milk was a dangerous substance. It spoiled incredibly quickly and could carry diseases. It was seen as a food for infants, the very old, or rural peasants. It was not a high-status drink for a royal court. Almonds, on the other hand, were perfect. They were shelf-stable, easy to transport, and highly nutritious. So almonds became the medieval cow. The royal kitchens used them in vast quantities. Almonds were imported from warmer climates like Spain and Italy, making them an expensive commodity. A queen's household accounts would show huge expenditures on almonds. Almond milk was made fresh daily. The process was simple but laborious. The almonds were blanched in hot water to remove their skins, then ground into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle. This almond flour was then mixed with water or sometimes broth and strained through a cloth. The result was a creamy, white liquid almond milk. This milk was the foundation of medieval aristocratic cooking, especially on fast days. It was used to make sauces, soups, stews, and desserts. The famous blancmange was based on it. Almond butter was made by cooking almond milk with sugar and spices until it was thick. Savory sauces for fish were made by thickening almond milk with breadcrumbs and seasoning it with vinegar and spices. For a queen, almond milk was everywhere. Her morning soup might be a caudle, made from almond milk, wine, and spices. Her Lenten feast would feature fish in a creamy almond sauce. Her desserts would be custards and jellies set with almond milk. The almonds themselves were also used in other ways. Ground almonds were a key ingredient in marzipan, the sugar and almond paste used to make subtleties. They were also used to thicken dishes, acting as a gluten-free flour long before the concept existed. A dish called mortreuse was a kind of pâté made from pounded meat or fish mixed with breadcrumbs and ground almonds. The reliance on almonds had a significant impact on the flavor profile of medieval elite cuisine. Many dishes had a subtle nutty undertone. This flavor, which we might associate with desserts, was common in savory main courses. A queen like Philippa of Hainault would have overseen a kitchen that was, in essence, a small factory for processing almonds. The daily grinding of almonds would have been a constant sound and activity. The quality of the almonds was a point of pride. A good cook knew how to select the best nuts and how to grind them to the perfect consistency. This reliance on a plant-based milk substitute shows that the medieval diet was more complex and adaptive than we often imagine. It was not just a world of roasted meat. For a queen navigating the complex rules of her faith while maintaining a luxurious and delicious diet, the humble almond was an indispensable ally. It was the key that unlocked a whole world of creamy, elegant cuisine no cow required. Number 10, what was the king of spices? In the hierarchy of the medieval spice cabinet, there was a clear king. It was not saffron for all its value. It was not cinnamon for all its sweetness. The undisputed king of spices, the one used more than any other in the kitchens of queens, was black pepper. Today, pepper is so common that we take it for granted. A shaker of it sits on every restaurant table. In the Middle Ages, it was a symbol of extreme wealth, a luxury item that traveled thousands of miles to reach a royal court. It was known as black gold. Peppercorns were so valuable they were used as currency. A man's wealth could be measured by the amount of pepper he had stored away. A pepper sack was a derogatory term for a rich but low-born merchant. Pepper came from the Malabar coast of India. The journey to Europe was long and perilous. It was carried by ship across the Indian Ocean, then by camel caravan across the deserts of the Middle East, and finally by Venetian or Genoese ships across the Mediterranean. At each stage of the journey, merchants and middlemen added their own markup. By the time a small pouch of peppercorns reached a castle in England or France, its price had been multiplied many times over. This incredible cost is what made it so desirable. Using pepper lavishly was a way for a queen to flaunt her wealth. Royal recipes from the period are often shocking to the modern reader for the sheer quantity of spices they call for. A sauce for a piece of beef might have a list of ingredients that includes pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, and nutmeg, all in large amounts. The goal was not a subtle blend of flavors. The goal was to create a powerful, overwhelming taste that screamed, "I am rich." But there was a more practical reason for the heavy use of pepper and other spices. Food preservation was a constant struggle. Much of the meat a queen ate, especially during the winter, was salted or smoked to keep it from rotting. This process left the meat with a strong, often unpleasant, salty flavor. Spices, and pepper in particular, were brilliant at masking these off flavors. A strong pepper sauce could make a piece of old, salted beef much more palatable. It wasn't about hiding rotten meat, as is sometimes claimed. It was about improving the taste of preserved meat. Pepper was also important in medieval medicine. Following the humoral system, it was classified as extremely hot and dry. It was believed to aid digestion by cooking the food in the stomach. A queen suffering from a cold stomach or poor digestion would be advised to eat peppery foods. It was thought to counteract the cold and wet humors that caused such ailments. In the royal kitchen, pepper was used in almost everything. It was in the savory pies, the sauces for meat and fish, the spiced wines, and even some desserts. Cooks used it whole, cracked, or finely ground. A queen like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had traveled to the east on crusade, would have had a sophisticated palate, familiar with the complex flavors of spices. Her feasts would have been famous for their bold, peppery dishes. The spice trade, driven by the European aristocracy's demand for pepper, had a profound impact on world history. The search for a cheaper, direct route to the source of spices is what motivated explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. The desire for the taste of pepper on a queen's plate literally changed the map of the world. It was a flavor that launched 1,000 ships. Number 9, could a flower be a main ingredient? We think of flowers today as decoration, a garnish on a salad or a cake. In a medieval queen's diet, flowers were often a key ingredient used for flavor, color, and medicine. The royal gardens were not just for beauty. They were an essential part of the kitchen's pantry. Primroses, violets, and roses were among the most commonly eaten flowers. Their petals were used in a variety of dishes. One popular use was in salads, which in the Middle Ages were called salads. The salad was often a mixture of cooked and raw greens, herbs, and flowers. A recipe from the 15th century calls for a salad of primrose buds, violets, and other spring greens, dressed with oil and vinegar. For a queen, a dish like this was a celebration of spring, a beautiful and fresh contrast to the heavy preserved foods of winter. Violets were particularly prized. Their beautiful color and delicate scent made them a favorite. Violet petals were candied by coating them in sugar syrup, creating a sweet, crunchy confection. They were also ground with sugar to make a paste called violet plate, which was eaten as a sweetmeat. A syrup made from violets was used to flavor drinks and custards and to add a beautiful purplish hue. The roses were the most versatile of the culinary flowers. Rose water, an infusion made by steeping rose petals in water, was a ubiquitous flavoring in aristocratic medieval kitchens, as common as vanilla extract is today. It was used in both sweet and savory dishes. A chicken dish might be seasoned with rose water and ginger. A custard or a jelly would almost certainly be flavored with it. The taste is floral and distinct, and it permeated much of elite cuisine. A queen's food would have smelled and tasted of roses. Rose petals themselves were used to make jams and conserves. They were also used in a dish called rose pudding, a sweet, thick pudding made from ground almonds, rice flour, and a great quantity of rose petals, all colored a vibrant pink. But flowers were not just for flavor and color. They were also medicine. Each flower was believed to have specific properties according to humoral theory. Violets, for example, were considered cool and moist. A syrup of violets would be given to a queen to treat a fever or a headache, ailments believed to be caused by an excess of heat. Roses were also seen as cooling and were used to soothe an upset stomach. Borage flowers, with their bright blue color, were thought to make a man merry and were used to treat melancholy. They were often floated in cups of wine for this purpose. A queen's personal physician would have worked closely with her gardeners and her cooks. The garden was a living pharmacy. If the queen was suffering from a particular ailment, the physician might prescribe a dish containing certain flowers and herbs. A queen like Elizabeth Woodville, living in a time of great political stress, might have been served dishes with borage and violets to calm her nerves and lift her spirits. Eating flowers was a sign of a sophisticated and well-resourced household. It required a large, well-tended garden and a staff that knew how to properly harvest and prepare the blossoms. It was another way to connect the beauty of the estate with the food on the table, turning the very landscape into an ingredient for the queen's plate. Number 8. What did a pomegranate mean to a queen? The pomegranate was not just a fruit. It was a jewel box of a fruit filled with glistening ruby red seeds. To a medieval queen, it was a potent and complex object representing fertility, royalty, and a connection to an exotic, faraway world. Pomegranates were not native to Northern Europe. They were a luxury import from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Their arrival in a cold, damp climate like England's was a marvel. It was a taste of the sun, a piece of an exotic land. This made them incredibly expensive and prestigious. A single pomegranate could be a worthy gift for a queen. The symbolism of the fruit was ancient and powerful. The sheer number of seeds packed inside the tough rind made it a universal symbol of fertility and abundance. For a queen, whose primary political duty was to produce heirs. This symbolism was deeply significant. To eat a pomegranate was, in a way, a prayer for her own fertility. It was a food that was intimately connected to her role as the mother of the dynasty. Catherine of Aragon, centuries later, would famously use the pomegranate as her personal badge, linking herself to its symbolism of fertility and her Spanish origins. The roots of this association were firmly planted in the medieval period. The fruit's appearance also contributed to its royal status. The deep red color of the seeds, or arils, was associated with royalty and power. The calyx at the top of the fruit even resembles a small crown. It was a fruit that looked the part. In the queen's kitchen, pomegranates were used in several ways. The bright, jewel-like seeds were often used as a garnish, scattered over roasted meats or pale dishes like blancmange. They added a splash of vibrant color and a burst of sweet tart flavor. They were a visual sign that this was a dish of the highest quality. The juice of the pomegranate was used to make sauces. A sauce for duck or chicken might be made with pomegranate juice, wine, and spices, creating a rich, dark, and tangy glaze. This use of fruit in savory sauces was very common in medieval cooking and provided a sweet and sour flavor profile that was highly prized. The fruit was also valued for its medicinal properties. It was considered to be a cooling food, beneficial for fevers and inflammation. The rind of the fruit was dried and powdered and used as a remedy for digestive ailments. A queen's physician might prescribe pomegranate juice to her as a refreshing and health-giving tonic. When a queen like Eleanor of Castile, who came from a land where pomegranates grew, received this fruit, it would have been a taste of home as well as a symbol of her royal status. For a queen from a northern country, it was a taste of the exotic. It connected her to the wider world of international trade, to the stories of the Crusades, and to the warm, sun-drenched lands where such marvels grew. Eating a pomegranate was a multi-sensory experience. The tough, leathery feel of the rind, the stunning visual of the red seeds, the unique sweet and tart flavor. For a queen, it was a food that engaged all the senses and was layered with meaning about her body, her power, and her place in the world. Number 7. Was this fish pie a deception? A medieval pie was often not what it seemed. The crust, or coffin, was a sturdy, thick pastry designed not just to be eaten, but to act as a cooking vessel and a serving dish. What was inside could be a surprise, and one of the most surprising pies on a Queen's Lenten table was the counterfeit fish pie. On the many fast days of the year, meat was forbidden. A queen's cooks were constantly challenged to create fish dishes that were as impressive and satisfying as the meat dishes served on other days. This led to a whole genre of culinary imitation. Cooks became experts at making fish look and taste like meat. A classic example was the fish pie designed to imitate a venison pasty. A cook would take a firm-fleshed fish like salmon or sturgeon and mince it. They would then mix this minced fish with spices that were typically used with venison, such as pepper, cloves, and mace. Dried fruits like raisins or prunes, also common in meat pies, would be added. To mimic the rich, dark color of a meat pie's gravy, the cook might use red wine and breadcrumbs. The real trick, however, was in the texture. To make the minced fish resemble the texture of ground meat, they would sometimes add pounded nuts or other binders. The entire mixture was then packed into a pie crust and baked. When served, it looked and smelled very much like a rich meat pie. The first bite, however, would reveal the truth. Another form of deception involved sculpting. A cook could take a large fish, like a pike, and skillfully mold its flesh. The fish would be cooked, the meat removed from the bones flaked, and then mixed with other ingredients like breadcrumbs, eggs if it wasn't a strict fast day, and spices. This fish paste was then molded back into the shape of another animal, perhaps a lamb or a piglet. It might be browned or colored to complete the illusion. This wasn't about tricking the queen into accidentally sinning. Everyone at the table knew it was a fast day, and that the dish was made of fish. The deception was part of the entertainment. It was a game, a display of the cook's incredible skill. It was a culinary joke that everyone was in on. For the queen, these counterfeit dishes were a testament to the ingenuity of her staff. They showed that her court could maintain a high level of creativity and luxury, even within the strict confines of religious observance. It was a way to make the restrictions of Lent feel less like a penance and more like an opportunity for artistic expression. A queen like Margaret of Anjou, known for her strong will and sophisticated court, would have presided over Lenten feasts filled with such clever creations. A pie that looked like venison, but tasted of salmon, was a conversation piece. It was a food that was meant to be talked about, admired, and enjoyed for its cleverness as much as its flavor. It elevated the act of eating into a form of intellectual amusement. It was a sign that even in piety, a queen's court never had to be dull. Number 6, why was green sauce on everything? If you could taste a single flavor that defined the food of a medieval queen, it might well be the sharp, herby tang of vert sauce or green sauce. This vibrant, uncooked sauce was a staple of medieval cuisine, served with almost everything, from roasted meat and boiled fish to vegetables, and even on its own as a dip for bread. Unlike the creamy cooked sauces we often think of, vert sauce was fresh and raw. Its base was a large quantity of herbs, primarily parsley and sage. Other herbs like mint, sorrel, and dill might be added depending on the season and the desired flavor. These herbs were not chopped finely as we would today. They were pounded into a smooth, green paste using a mortar and pestle. This was a laborious task that would have been performed by a junior member of the kitchen staff. To this herb paste, 2 key ingredients were added: breadcrumbs and vinegar. The breadcrumbs acted as a thickener, giving the sauce body. The vinegar provided a sharp, acidic kick that was characteristic of medieval sauces. This acidity was important. It helped to cut through the richness of fatty meats and fish. It also had a preservative effect and was believed to aid digestion. The final sauce was a thick, textured, bright green paste with a powerful, assertive flavor. It was intensely herby from the parsley and sage, and very sour from the vinegar. Sometimes a little ginger or pepper was added for extra warmth, but the primary flavors were green and sharp. For a queen, this sauce was a constant presence on the dining table. A platter of roasted chicken would be accompanied by a bowl of vert sauce. Boiled fish, a common dish on fast days, would be made much more exciting by a generous spoonful of it. It was the medieval equivalent of ketchup or mustard, a universal condiment that added flavor and moisture to a wide range of foods. The popularity of vert sauce also tells us something about the medieval palate. They loved strong, bold flavors, particularly sour and spicy ones. The subtle, balanced flavors we often strive for in modern cooking were not the goal. A medieval feast was an assault on the senses, and the food was no exception. A vert sauce, with its powerful punch of herbs and vinegar, was a perfect expression of this taste preference. There was also a visual element. The bright green color of the sauce would have looked beautiful on the table, a splash of freshness against the browns of roasted meats and the whites of bread. Color, as we've seen, was always important. A queen's cook would have had his own specific recipe for vert sauce. The quality of the sauce was a point of pride. It had to have the right consistency, the perfect balance of herbs and vinegar, and a vibrant color. A queen like Isabella of France, who was known for her lavish lifestyle, would have demanded the very best. Her vert sauce would have been made with the freshest herbs from the castle gardens and the finest wine vinegar. It was a simple sauce made from common ingredients, but its ubiquity on the royal table shows that even the most basic elements of a queen's diet were prepared with care and skill, and were part of a distinct and powerful flavor world that was very different from our own. Number 5, could you drink your dinner? In the medieval court, a meal was not always something you chewed. A significant part of a queen's diet, and that of her court, came in liquid form. Soups, broths, and pottages were a daily staple. But there was another category of liquid meal that was particularly important: the caudle. A caudle was a warm, thick drink, a cross between a soup, a pudding, and a beverage. It was a nourishing and comforting concoction served to everyone from kings to commoners, but with variations in richness that denoted status. The base of a caudle was typically wine or ale. This was thickened with egg yolks and or breadcrumbs or ground almonds. It was then sweetened with honey or sugar and spiced with expensive flavorings like saffron, ginger, and mace. For a queen, a caudle was a versatile part of her diet. It could be a light breakfast, a comforting bedtime drink, or a restorative meal when she was feeling unwell. A queen in the morning might break her fast, not with a large plate of food, but with a warm, spiced wine caudle served in a silver cup. It was warming, easy to digest, and provided a quick source of energy. Caudles were especially important for women after childbirth. Giving birth was a dangerous and draining experience in the Middle Ages. A new mother was considered to be in a delicate state, and her diet was carefully managed to help her recover. Caudles were the cornerstone of this postpartum diet. They were believed to be highly nutritious, to restore a woman's strength, and to help with the production of breast milk. A queen who had just delivered a royal heir, like Eleanor of Castile, would have been served rich, spiced caudles several times a day by her ladies-in-waiting. These would have been made with the best wine, the most expensive sugar, and the finest spices. The ingredients reflected the humoral theory of medicine. Her wine was considered hot and moist, as were egg yolks. Spices were hot and dry. A caudle was therefore a warming and balancing food, perfect for someone who had been weakened or chilled by the ordeal of labor. There were many variations. A caudle fairy was made with wine and colored a vibrant yellow with a large amount of saffron. A simple caudle for a less important person might be made with ale instead of wine and honey instead of sugar. But for the queen, only the best ingredients would do. This practice of drinking a significant portion of one's calories was common. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat or fish, was the staple food for most of the population. While a queen ate a much more varied diet, pottages and broths were still a part of it. A clear, rich meat broth, or consomme, was considered a great restorative. So, when we picture a queen at her meal, we shouldn't just imagine her carving a piece of meat. We should also picture her sipping from a cup of warm, thick, spiced wine. This liquid meal was just as important and just as revealing of her status and the medical beliefs of her time as any solid food on her plate. For a medieval queen, drinking your dinner was a normal and necessary part of life. Number 4. Why did a queen's pastry have a secret identity? The pasty or pie, with its hearty pastry crust, is something we often associate with common folk, a portable meal for a miner or a farmer. But in the medieval royal court, the pie, or pasty, was a high-status dish, and its crust often concealed a surprising secret: it wasn't meant to be eaten. This might sound strange, but the primary purpose of the pastry on many large medieval pies was not culinary. It was structural. This thick, heavy crust, made from a simple flour and water dough, was called a coffin. The name is telling. It was a container, a vessel, for the fillings inside. This dough was tough and dense, designed to withstand long baking times and to be strong enough to hold its shape. Think of it as an edible, disposable baking dish. The royal cook would mold this thick pastry into the shape of a large pie. The filling, perhaps a whole stewed bird, a mixture of chopped meats, or a rich fish mixture for Lent, was placed inside. The top crust was put on and sealed. The whole thing was then baked, often for a very long time. The crust trapped the steam and moisture from the filling, essentially stewing the contents in their own juices. This resulted in a very tender and flavorful filling. When the pie was brought to the table, it was the contents that mattered. The pie would be opened up, and the rich, stewed filling would be spooned out and served to the queen and her guests. The thick, hard-baked crust, which was often dry and tasteless after its long time in the oven, was frequently discarded. It was given to the servants or to the poor who waited at the castle gates for alms. This distinction between the filling for the lord and the crust for the poor was a clear social marker. The queen ate the luxurious interior, the lower classes got the functional exterior. However, this was not always the case. There were also smaller, more delicate pies and tarts where the pastry enriched with butter or lard was very much intended to be eaten. But for the great centerpiece pies of a royal feast, the crust was often just a shell. This use of pastry as a container led to some incredible creations. We've already seen how a pie crust could be used to hide live birds. They were also used to create illusion foods. A cook might mold the pastry coffin into the shape of a dragon or a castle. The filling would be appropriate, perhaps a spicy meat mixture for a dragon. This functional use of pastry explains why medieval recipes often give very vague instructions for the crust, while being very detailed about the spiced filling. The filling was the star of the show. For a queen, this type of pie was a practical way to serve a complex, slow-cooked dish to a large number of people in an elegant way. A large pasty could be brought to the high table, opened with a flourish, and its fragrant contents served. It was a piece of culinary theater that also served a very practical purpose. It demonstrates a different way of thinking about food, where one part of a dish could be a tool, a container, to be discarded after use, while the other part was a treasure to be savored. Number 3, what were umbles and why were they eaten? In the highly hierarchical world of a medieval royal court, every part of an animal had its place. The best cuts of meat, the prime roasts and choice steaks, went to the queen and the high table. The lesser parts, the internal organs, the heart, liver, lungs, and intestines, were known as the umbles. And while the queen herself might not have eaten them regularly, their consumption was a vital part of her household's economy and social structure. To eat humble pie is a phrase that comes directly from this practice. When a deer was hunted in the royal forest, it was a significant event. The deer was brought back to the castle and butchered with great ceremony. The haunches and the back, the venison, were reserved for the queen's table. But nothing was wasted. The umbles were given to the huntsmen and the lower-ranking members of the court as their share of the kill. They would then make a pie from these organs, a umble pie. So to eat umble pie was to literally eat the humble parts of the animal, a food for those of lower status. While the queen herself might not eat this pie, the organs were not entirely absent from her diet. Liver, in particular, was often used in cooking for the high table. It was frequently pounded into a paste to make pates or mortars, or used to enrich sauces and stuffings. These dishes, however, would have been highly refined and spiced, disguising the humble origin of the ingredient. The concept of using the entire animal was central to medieval life. It was a matter of both economy and respect. A large animal was a huge source of food, and wasting any part of it was unthinkable. The skin was used for leather, the bones were boiled for broth, the fat was rendered for cooking and lighting, and every part of the flesh, from the tongue to the tail, was consumed by someone in the household. The queen, as the manager of this large and complex household, would have been well aware of this system. Her kitchen accounts would detail the distribution of all parts of the animal. It was a well-ordered system where everyone knew their place, right down to the food they were entitled to eat. Sometimes certain organs were considered delicacies. The tongue of a whale, as we've seen, was reserved for the king. The tongue of an ox or a deer was also a prized cut. Tripe, the stomach lining of a cow, was another organ meat that was eaten across social classes, often stewed in a milky or savory broth. The medical beliefs of the time also played a role. The liver was thought to be the source of blood and was considered a very nourishing food, good for building strength. A queen's physician might even recommend a dish containing liver if she was thought to be weak or anemic. So, while the image of a queen eating a plate of offal might seem surprising, it was an integral part of her world. The consumption of umbles by her court was a reflection of the social order she presided over. It was a system that ensured nothing was wasted and everyone was fed, from the highest to the humblest. The umble pie on the servant's table was as much a part of the queen's feast as the venison on her own plate. Number 2, why was a poisonous plant a common ingredient? In the herb gardens of a medieval castle, among the parsley and sage, grew a plant called tansy. It's a pretty plant with yellow, button-like flowers and ferny leaves. It also happens to be toxic. Yet, for a medieval queen and her court, tansy was a common and important culinary ingredient, especially around Easter. Tansy has a very strong, bitter, and aromatic flavor. In small quantities, it was used as a spice to flavor puddings and omelets. A dish simply called a tansy was a staple of late medieval and Tudor cuisine. It was a sweet, baked custard, similar to a quiche or a frittata, that was colored a vibrant green with the juice of tansy leaves and other herbs like spinach. The connection with Easter was symbolic. The bitter flavor of the herb was thought to recall the bitter herbs of the Jewish Passover and the sufferings of Christ. Eating tansy at Easter was an act of religious observance. Furthermore, after the bland and restricted diet of Lent, the strong, pungent flavor of tansy was a welcome shock to the palate. It was a taste that signaled the end of fasting and the beginning of celebration. A queen's Easter feast would almost certainly have included a tansy. Her cooks would have prepared a large green custard-like tart, richly flavored with the herb and sweetened with sugar. It was a dish that was both festive and pious, but the use of tansy came with a significant risk. The plant contains a compound called thujoni, which is a potent toxin. In large doses, it can cause convulsions and organ failure. Medieval people were aware of its potency. Tansy was widely used in medicine as a powerful vermifuge, a substance to expel intestinal worms. It was also used to induce abortions. This dual role as a food and a powerful, dangerous medicine was not unusual in the medieval world. Many herbs had this double identity. The key was dosage. The amount of tansy used in a recipe had to be very carefully controlled. A queen's cook would have been an expert in this. He would have known exactly how much tansy juice to add to the custard to provide the desired flavor and color without endangering the health of the royal family. It was a high-stakes culinary balancing act. A mistake could have serious consequences. This highlights the thin line that often existed between food and poison in the medieval court. A queen lived with the constant, low-level fear of being poisoned by her enemies. Her food was prepared in a secure kitchen and often tasted by a designated food taster before she ate. The use of a potentially toxic ingredient like tansy, even for traditional reasons, must have added to this undercurrent of risk. She had to place immense trust in the skill and loyalty of her cook. So when a queen took a bite of her Easter tansy, she was tasting a complex mixture of faith, tradition, and danger. It was a flavor that was deeply embedded in the religious calendar and the medical knowledge of her time, but one that also carried a hint of risk, a reminder of the fragility of life. Number one, why was dirt an ingredient in a queen's food? The most surprising ingredient on a queen's menu was not an animal or a plant, it was a type of edible clay. This practice, known as geophagy or earth eating, seems utterly bizarre to us today. But in the medieval world, certain types of fine clay were considered to be a powerful medicine and were sometimes consumed by the wealthy, including, it is believed, pregnant women and queens. You know, this wasn't just any dirt from the garden. Like, the specific type of clay used was known as terra sigillata, which means sealed earth. It came from specific locations, most famously the Greek island of Lemnos. This Lemnian earth was considered the most potent. The clay was mined, washed, and formed into small cakes or tablets, which were then stamped with an official seal, hence the name. This seal was a guarantee of authenticity and quality. These clay tablets were a highly valued item in the medieval pharmacy. They were believed to be a panacea, a cure-all for a wide range of ailments. Their most important property was as an antidote to poison. It was believed that if you had been poisoned, eating a small amount of terra sigillata, usually dissolved in wine or water, could save your life. For a queen living in a world of political intrigue where poison was a real and present danger, having a supply of this sealed earth would have been a crucial part of her personal medical kit. It was also used to treat stomach ailments, dysentery, and the plague. The clay's absorbent properties are real. It can bind with certain toxins, which is the basis for modern treatments like activated charcoal. So, while their understanding was different, the medieval physicians were not entirely wrong about its effects. There is also evidence to suggest that pregnant women sometimes consumed clay. This might have been to soothe morning sickness, or, as is still practiced in some cultures today, to supplement their diet with minerals like calcium and iron. A queen, desperate to ensure a healthy pregnancy and a safe delivery, might have been prescribed a small amount of this medicinal earth by her physicians. The craving for non-food items, a condition known as pica, is common in pregnancy, and this medical practice might have been a way to address it. The trade in terra sigillata was a serious business. It was an expensive import, another luxury item that spoke of wealth and a connection to the classical world, as its use dated back to ancient Greece and Rome. The seal on the tablet was like a brand name, a guarantee that this was the genuine, powerful medicine from the famous source. So, in the queen's private chambers, locked away in a chest with her spices and other remedies, might have been a small sealed cake of clay. It was not food in the normal sense, but it was something she might consume. It represents the ultimate intersection of food, medicine, and fear. It was a taste of the earth itself, consumed in the hope of cheating death and securing the future of a dynasty. It is perhaps the most surprising taste of all from a medieval queen's world.